The morning of April 17, 1945. Over the East China Sea, roughly 40 nautical miles southeast of Okinawa, Lieutenant Commander James Harwood adjusted his oxygen mask and scanned the horizon through the greenhouse canopy of his TBM Avenger. Below him, the ocean stretched grey and featureless under heavy cloud cover. Behind him sat his radio man and turret gunner, their voices crackling occasionally through the intercom, with terse observations about weather conditions and fuel state. The Avenger belonged to Torpedo Squadron 82, operating from the escort carrier USS Anzio, and this morning's mission was armed reconnaissance, searching for Japanese shipping, attempting to resupply their garrison forces on Okinawa. What hung beneath Harwood's aircraft that morning represented a technological capability that Japanese naval intelligence had systematically underestimated throughout the Pacific War. Suspended in the Avenger's capacious bomb bay was a Mark 13 aerial torpedo, a weapon weighing just over 2,000 pounds, fully assembled. Japanese analysts, working from fragmentary combat observations, captured documents and technical assessments of earlier American torpedo bombers, had concluded that the Avenger's maximum ordnance load approximated 1,600 pounds. This miscalculation, seemingly modest in magnitude, reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of American naval aviation's engineering priorities and industrial capabilities. More critically, it contributed to Japanese tactical planning that consistently underestimated the striking power of American carrier air groups during the war's final 18 months. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The intelligence failure was not the result of negligence or incompetence among Japanese naval analysts. Rather, it emerged from reasonable extrapolations, based on observable patterns in American aircraft development during the early war years, combined with the chronic difficulties of obtaining accurate technical intelligence under combat conditions. Japanese observers had carefully studied the TBD Devastator, America's frontline torpedo bomber during 1942, noting its limited payload capacity and modest performance characteristics. When the TBM Avenger began appearing in combat during the latter half of 1942, Japanese intelligence officers attempted to assess its capabilities through combat observation, examination of wreckage recovered from shot-down aircraft, and interrogation of captured aircrew. These methods yielded fragmentary and often contradictory information. Avengers encountered in combat typically attacked from considerable distances under heavy defensive fire, making precise observation of ordnance loads difficult. Wreckage recovered from crashed aircraft rarely included intact ordnance or complete bomb bay assemblies that would reveal load-carrying capacity. Captured American aircrew, following standard procedures, provided only minimal information beyond name, rank, and service number. Japanese analysts worked with incomplete data, filling gaps through extrapolation and assumption based on their understanding of American design philosophy and observed operational patterns. The assessment that emerged from this analytical process placed the Avenger's maximum torpedo load at approximately 1,600 pounds, a figure consistent with what Japanese observers had documented for earlier American torpedo bombers and seemingly reasonable given the aircraft's observed dimensions and performance. This conclusion circulated through Japanese naval intelligence channels, informing tactical planning documents and operational assessments. Fleet commanders planning defensive deployments against American carrier strikes incorporated these assumed limitations into their calculations of target threat levels and required defensive responses. The miscalculation would persist, largely uncorrected, until Japan's final months of the war. Understanding why Japanese intelligence underestimated the Avenger requires examining the aircraft's development within the broader context of American naval aviation's evolution during the late 1930s and early 1940s. The United States Navy had identified carrier-based torpedo attack as a critical capability, recognizing that aerial torpedoes offered the most effective means of inflicting catastrophic damage on enemy capital ships. Heavy bombs could damage warships severely, but torpedoes struck below the waterline where armor protection was typically lighter and where hull breaches caused progressive flooding that could sink even heavily armored vessels. The Douglas TBD Devastator, which entered service in 1937, represented the Navy's first attempt to create a modern carrier-based torpedo bomber, incorporating contemporary engineering advances. The aircraft featured an enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, and all-metal construction, significant improvements over earlier biplane torpedo bombers. However, the Devastator carried fundamental limitations that became increasingly apparent as the naval air war intensified. Its maximum speed barely exceeded 200 miles per hour, making it dangerously vulnerable to enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. More critically, for long-range strike operations, the Devastator's payload capacity restricted it to carrying either one Mark 13 torpedo weighing approximately 1,300 pounds, or an equivalent bomb load. By 1940, as war clouds gathered across the Pacific, the Navy recognized the urgent need for a replacement that could deliver substantially greater striking power while surviving in increasingly hostile combat environments. The Bureau of Aeronautics issued specification requirements for a new torpedo bomber, emphasizing three critical capabilities: substantially increased speed for survivability, significantly greater range to enable strikes against distant targets, and expanded payload capacity to carry heavier weapons or larger bomb loads. The specification reflected lessons emerging from the European War, where aircraft lacking adequate performance characteristics suffered catastrophic losses when engaging modern defenses. Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation responded with a design that would become the TBM Avenger. The company's engineers approached the problem systematically, recognizing that achieving the Navy's ambitious requirements demanded a substantially larger and more powerful aircraft than the Devastator. They selected the Wright R-2856 Cyclone 14 radial engine, an air-cooled power plant producing 1,700 horsepower that provided the substantial power necessary for acceptable performance while carrying heavy ordnance loads. The airframe design emphasized ruggedness and payload capacity, incorporating a spacious internal bomb bay capable of accommodating large weapons without external carriage that would increase drag and reduce performance. The Avenger's internal bomb bay represented a critical design feature that distinguished it from many contemporary attack aircraft. Rather than carrying torpedoes or heavy bombs externally on underwing or under fuselage racks, where they created substantial aerodynamic drag, the Avenger enclosed ordnance entirely within the fuselage. This configuration reduced drag significantly, improving both speed and range while carrying heavy loads. More importantly for operational flexibility, the bomb bay dimensions and structural load-bearing capacity permitted carrying a wider variety of weapons than external racks typically accommodated. The design could accept the Mark 13 torpedo, various conventional bombs up to 2,000 pounds, depth charges for anti-submarine warfare, or mines for offensive mining operations. Japanese naval intelligence organizations approached the problem of assessing enemy capabilities through systematic methodologies developed over decades of professional military analysis. The Navy's intelligence apparatus included specialized sections dedicated to technical evaluation of foreign aircraft, weapons systems, and operational doctrine. These analysts possessed substantial technical competence, many having received engineering education at Japanese universities or having served in technical positions aboard warships or at naval air stations. They understood aircraft design principles, propulsion systems, weapons characteristics, and the complex engineering trade-offs that shaped aircraft performance. However, technical competence alone could not overcome the fundamental challenge of assessing enemy capabilities under wartime conditions, where direct access to intact examples remained impossible, and where information arrived through fragmentary and often unreliable channels. Japanese intelligence analysts worked with several sources of varying reliability and completeness. Combat reports from pilots and observers provided first-hand accounts of encounters with American aircraft, but these reports necessarily reflected the chaos and confusion of aerial combat rather than systematic controlled observation. Pilots engaging enemy aircraft at high speed while maneuvering violently and managing weapons systems could rarely observe technical details with precision. Wreckage recovered from shot-down aircraft offered more concrete evidence, but presented its own analytical challenges. Impact forces typically destroyed delicate components and distorted structures, making precise measurements difficult. Critical components like engines or weapons systems often burned in post-crash fires or sank in deep water beyond recovery. Even when substantial wreckage could be examined, determining an aircraft's maximum capabilities from damaged fragments required informed extrapolation. An engine recovered from a crashed aircraft revealed displacement and basic configuration, but determining maximum power output required either finding manufacturers' data plates with specifications or conducting test runs rarely possible with battle-damaged engines. Captured documents occasionally provided valuable intelligence when American aircraft crashed on Japanese-controlled territory and aircrew failed to destroy sensitive materials before capture or death. However, individual aircraft rarely carried comprehensive technical manuals or detailed specification documents. Pilots flew with abbreviated checklists, tactical procedures, and navigational materials, but seldom possessed engineering drawings or performance data that would reveal an aircraft's full capabilities. Intelligence value of captured documents varied tremendously, depending on what specific materials happened to be aboard any particular aircraft when it went down. Interrogation of captured aircrew represented another potential intelligence source, but one that consistently disappointed Japanese interrogators throughout the Pacific War. American military training emphasized resistance to interrogation, instructing personnel to provide only name, rank, service number, and date of birth, as required under international law. Most captured American aviators adhered strictly to these instructions despite interrogation pressure. Even aviators willing to provide additional information typically possessed limited technical knowledge beyond what they needed for operating their specific aircraft. Pilots understood flight controls, basic systems operation, and tactical procedures, but rarely knew detailed specifications like maximum payload capacity, fuel tank volumes, or engine performance curves that would interest intelligence analysts. The TBM Avenger that entered fleet service in August of 1942 embodied engineering decisions that directly contradicted assumptions underlying Japanese intelligence assessments. Grumman's design team had created an aircraft substantially larger and more capable than the Devastator it replaced, but this capability came at the cost of increased size and weight that Japanese analysts might reasonably have expected to limit payload capacity. The Avenger measured 40 feet and 11 inches in length with a wingspan of 54 feet and 2 inches, dimensions noticeably larger than the Devastator's 35-foot length and 50-foot wingspan. Empty weight reached 10,555 pounds compared to the Devastator's 6,782 pounds. These dimensional and weight increases suggested to external observers that the Avenger represented an incremental improvement over its predecessor rather than a fundamental leap in capability. Japanese analysts, examining fragmentary evidence and applying conventional design logic, reasonably concluded that the additional size and weight served primarily to accommodate increased fuel capacity for extended range, improved crew accommodations for long missions, and defensive armament, including a dorsal turret with a half-inch caliber machine gun. The assumption that payload capacity remained relatively modest, perhaps 1,600 pounds maximum, appeared consistent with observed aircraft dimensions and the general principle that larger, heavier aircraft required more power simply to achieve acceptable flight performance, leaving less margin for heavy ordnance. This analytical framework failed to account for several critical factors in the Avenger's design. The Wright R2856 engine produced substantially more power than Japanese analysts apparently credited, delivering 1,700 horsepower for takeoff and maintaining excellent power output at altitude. This exceptional power plant provided sufficient thrust to lift heavy loads while maintaining acceptable performance characteristics. More significantly, Grumman's engineers had designed the internal bomb bay with generous dimensions and robust load-bearing structure, specifically to accommodate weapons up to 2,000 pounds, the heaviest standard ordnance in the navies. Inventory during the early war period. The bomb bay measured approximately 10 feet in length and possessed sufficient width and height to fully enclose a Mark 13 torpedo or a 2,000-pound general-purpose bomb. The structural components surrounding the bay bulkheads, longerons, and load-bearing frames were engineered to distribute weapon loads throughout the airframe rather than concentrating stress at mounting points. This structural approach permitted carrying maximum loads without exceeding safe stress limits on any individual component. The bomb bay doors operated through a unique rotational mechanism that tucked them flush against the fuselage sides when open, eliminating the aerodynamic disruption that traditional hinged doors created and allowing the aircraft to maintain better performance during weapons release. American ordnance specialists had simultaneously developed improvements to the Mark 13 aerial torpedo that enhanced its effectiveness while maintaining compatibility with the Avenger's payload capacity. Early war versions of the Mark 13 suffered from reliability problems, including frequent failures of depth control mechanisms and contact exploders that prevented detonation even when torpedoes struck targets directly. These deficiencies reflected inadequate pre-war testing under realistic conditions and manufacturing quality control problems that persisted into early production runs. By 1944, however, intensive development programs had largely resolved these problems through improved depth control systems, more reliable exploders, and better manufacturing processes. The refined Mark 13 measured 13 feet and 5 inches in length, with a diameter of 22.5 inches, and weighed 2,116 pounds when fully assembled with warhead, fuel, and compressed air propulsion system. The warhead contained approximately 600 pounds of Torpex explosive, a mixture significantly more powerful than TNT that could inflict catastrophic damage on warship hulls. The torpedo's propulsion system drove it through water at approximately 33 knots with an effective range exceeding 6,000 yards under optimal conditions, though practical combat ranges typically fell well short of theoretical maximum. Carrying this substantial weapon imposed certain operational limitations on the Avenger that Japanese observers might have detected through careful analysis of American carrier operations. Maximum takeoff weight with a full torpedo load reached 17,364 pounds, requiring substantial takeoff run even with the powerful radial engine delivering full power. Carrier operations demanded careful attention to wind conditions, ship speed, and catapult settings to ensure heavily loaded Avengers could safely become airborne. Once airborne with maximum ordnance load, the aircraft's performance degraded noticeably compared to lightly loaded or clean configuration, with reduced maximum speed, slower climb rate, and decreased maneuverability that made the aircraft more vulnerable to enemy fighters. The accumulation of evidence that should have revealed the Avenger's true capabilities occurred gradually through repeated operational encounters across the Pacific Theater during 1943 and 1944. Japanese forces faced Avenger strikes during virtually every major naval engagement following the aircraft's combat debut at Guadalcanal in August of 1942. These encounters provided numerous opportunities for observation, analysis, and reassessment of initial capability estimates. Yet the intelligence apparatus struggled to synthesize fragmentary observations into accurate, comprehensive assessment, hampered by institutional factors, communication difficulties, and the increasingly desperate strategic situation that diverted attention toward immediate tactical problems. The Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944 provided particularly dramatic evidence of American carrier striking power, though the engagement's chaotic nature and overwhelming American victory complicated Japanese efforts to conduct systematic technical analysis. American carrier task forces deployed 15 aircraft carriers, including 7 fleet carriers and 8 light carriers, embarking approximately 900 aircraft. This massive force represented industrial capacity that Japanese planners found almost incomprehensible. The United States had constructed more fleet carriers in 2 years than Japan possessed in total, while simultaneously building dozens of escort carriers and maintaining production of land-based aircraft for the Army Air Forces. During the battle's opening phases, American carrier air groups launched massive strikes against Japanese positions in the Mariana Islands and against the Japanese mobile fleet attempting to counter the American invasion. Avengers participated extensively in these operations, attacking both land targets and warships with torpedoes, bombs, and rockets. Japanese defenders observed Avengers dropping weapons that appeared substantially larger than the 1,600-pound ordnance they expected. But the confusion of combat and the devastating effectiveness of American attacks prevented systematic documentation of observed weapon sizes. The battle's aftermath, which American participants called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, due to the lopsided loss ratio favoring American forces, left Japanese naval aviation devastated. Approximately 600 Japanese aircraft were destroyed during the engagement against American losses of approximately 123 aircraft, many lost to operational accidents rather than combat. 3 Japanese carriers were sunk. The loss of experienced aircrew proved even more catastrophic than aircraft losses, as Japan's pilot training programs could not replace skilled aviators at anything approaching the rate they were being lost in combat. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. This devastating defeat focused Japanese attention on fundamental strategic problems: catastrophic pilot losses, overwhelming American numerical superiority, and the complete collapse of Japan's defensive perimeter rather than technical intelligence questions about specific aircraft capabilities. Senior commanders and staff officers devoted their limited analytical resources to determining how to counter numerically superior American forces with dwindling Japanese assets rather than refining assessments of individual American aircraft types. The question of whether Avengers carried 1,600 or 2,000-pound torpedoes seemed almost academic when American task forces could launch strikes comprising hundreds of aircraft against targets defended by dozens of Japanese fighters. Combat reports from Japanese pilots who survived encounters with Avengers during subsequent operations occasionally included observations suggesting weapons heavier than intelligence assessments predicted. Pilots reported seeing large or heavy torpedoes dropped by attacking Avengers, or noted particularly destructive explosions when torpedoes struck Japanese vessels. However, these qualitative observations competed with numerous other tactical reports flooding through intelligence channels, and they lacked the technical specificity needed to prompt formal reassessment of established capability estimates. A pilot's observation that an enemy torpedo appeared large provided limited analytical value without precise measurements or detailed technical knowledge. The intelligence failure persisted partly because Japanese forces rarely recovered intact American ordnance for detailed technical examination. Torpedoes that missed their targets typically sank in deep water beyond salvage capability. Torpedoes that struck ships and detonated obviously could not be examined afterward. Occasionally, torpedoes failed to detonate after striking targets, but these duds typically lodged deep in damaged hull sections that flooded immediately or exploded when salvage crews attempted recovery. The few opportunities Japanese technical specialists had to examine captured American torpedoes occurred primarily in isolated instances where damaged aircraft crashed on Japanese-held territory with ordnance still aboard, or where torpedoes dropped during attacks on shore installations could be recovered before they sank. By 1945, as American forces advanced inexorably toward the Japanese home islands, the cumulative effect of systematically underestimating American capabilities had contributed substantially to Japan's catastrophic strategic position. The Avenger payload miscalculation represented merely one element within a broader pattern of intelligence failures that consistently led Japanese planners to underestimate American industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and operational capabilities. These failures were not simply technical errors by incompetent analysts, but rather reflected systemic problems in how Japanese military institutions gathered, analyzed, and disseminated intelligence under the immense pressures of losing a total war. The organizational culture within Japanese military intelligence services emphasized maintaining established assessments and avoiding conclusions that contradicted prevailing strategic narratives or challenged assumptions held by senior commanders. Junior analysts who identified evidence suggesting American capabilities exceeded official estimates faced pressure to conform to institutional consensus rather than advocating for reassessment. This cultural dynamic discouraged the kind of rigorous self-criticism and willingness to acknowledge error that effective intelligence analysis requires. When fragmentary evidence suggested Avengers might carry heavier ordnance than estimated, the institutional tendency was to explain away discrepancies rather than initiate comprehensive reassessment. Communication difficulties between field units, operational commands, and central intelligence organizations further hampered efforts to synthesize accurate capability assessments. Combat reports from forward units often failed to reach intelligence analysts in Tokyo for weeks or months due to communications disruptions, loss of reports during ship sinkings, and the general chaos of Japan's deteriorating military situation. Even when reports reached intelligence staff, the volume of incoming information overwhelmed limited analytical capacity, forcing analysts to prioritize immediate tactical intelligence over systematic, long-term assessment programs. The consequences of underestimating the Avengers' striking power manifested in tactical planning that allocated insufficient defensive resources to counter carrier airstrikes. Japanese commanders planning defensive deployments against American naval forces calculated required fighter strength and anti-aircraft gun coverage, based partly on assumptions about the tonnage of ordnance American carrier air groups could deliver per sortie. If intelligence estimates consistently understated American aircraft payload capacity by 20 to 25%, the approximate difference between 1,600 and 2,000-pound weapons, then defensive planning systematically under-allocated resources needed to counter actual American striking power. This miscalculation compounded other intelligence failures that collectively left Japanese forces consistently surprised by American operational capabilities. Japanese intelligence had underestimated American industrial capacity, projecting that the United States could not simultaneously support major ground campaigns in Europe while building overwhelming naval superiority in the Pacific. They had underestimated American technological sophistication, assuming that rapid mass production necessarily implied crude, unsophisticated designs rather than the increasingly refined weapon systems American industry actually produced. They had underestimated American operational flexibility, expecting rigid adherence to predictable patterns rather than the adaptive, aggressive approach American commanders actually employed. The systematic nature of these intelligence failures reflected fundamental misunderstandings about American society, industrial organization, and military culture that Japanese pre-war assumptions had embedded deeply in institutional thinking. Japanese military theorists had long argued that individualistic Western societies lacked the spiritual cohesion and willingness to accept sacrifice that would enable them to prevail in protracted total war against a unified nation like Japan. This ideological framework predisposed analysts toward conclusions that minimized American capabilities and emphasized presumed American weaknesses. Evidence that contradicted these comfortable assumptions encountered institutional resistance, while evidence that confirmed them was readily accepted and incorporated into planning. By the time Lieutenant Commander Harwood flew his mission over the East China Sea in April of 1945, the question of Japanese intelligence assessments regarding Avenger payload capacity had become largely moot. Japan faced imminent invasion, her cities burned by American firebombing campaigns, her navy destroyed, her merchant fleet sunk, and her industrial capacity shattered. Whether Japanese commanders precisely understood that each Avenger could carry 2,000 pounds of ordnance rather than 1,600 mattered little when American carrier task forces operating with near impunity could launch strike after strike without effective opposition. The intelligence failure was real, but its significance paled beside the larger catastrophe of Japan's complete strategic defeat. The operational reality that Japanese intelligence assessments had failed to capture fully manifested during the final desperate months of the Pacific War, as American carrier task forces operated virtually unopposed off the Japanese coast. By spring of 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. The remnants of the once formidable combined fleet lay scattered across the Pacific floor or immobilized in harbors, lacking fuel to sortie, even if crews and escorts had been available. Japanese naval aviation, which had begun the war with superbly trained pilots flying capable aircraft, had been ground down through cumulative attrition until only poorly trained replacement pilots remained, flying increasingly obsolete aircraft with inadequate fuel for proper training. Avengers participated extensively in the final carrier operations against the Japanese home islands during the summer of 1945, striking targets ranging from remaining naval vessels to coastal installations, airfields, and transportation infrastructure. The aircraft's substantial payload capacity, whether carrying 2,000-pound bombs, multiple smaller bombs, or rockets, enabled it to deliver devastating strikes against targets that earlier in the war might have required coordination of multiple aircraft types. A single Avenger could carry ordnance loads that approached what an entire three-plane division of Devastators might have delivered in 1942, reflecting both improved aircraft capability and the sophisticated weapons that American industry now produced in vast quantities. Japanese defenders attempting to counter these strikes faced overwhelming disadvantages that rendered tactical details like precise knowledge of enemy aircraft payload capacity almost irrelevant to outcomes. American formations typically included massive fighter escorts that swept aside the limited Japanese interceptor forces with catastrophic loss ratios. Japanese anti-aircraft defenses, depleted by years of combat losses and hampered by ammunition shortages and degraded fire control equipment, proved largely ineffective against coordinated attacks by experienced American air crews. The few Japanese fighters that managed to engage American strike formations found themselves outnumbered, outperformed by superior American aircraft, and outmatched by better-trained American pilots who had survived long enough to accumulate combat experience that Japanese replacement pilots never acquired. The intelligence failure regarding Avenger payload capacity thus existed within a context where precise technical knowledge increasingly mattered less than overwhelming material superiority. Even if Japanese commanders had possessed completely accurate assessments of every American aircraft type's exact capabilities, this knowledge could not have altered fundamental realities. The United States possessed industrial capacity that allowed simultaneous production of thousands of combat aircraft monthly, while Japan struggled to produce hundreds. American pilot training programs generated adequately prepared aviators faster than combat consumed them, while Japanese training, crippled by fuel shortages and loss of experienced instructors, produced pilots with minimal preparation who survived only briefly in combat. The systematic underestimation of American capabilities that the Avenger payload miscalculation exemplified had contributed to catastrophically flawed strategic planning throughout the war. Japanese pre-war strategy had assumed that American forces, while potentially dangerous if given time to mobilize, lacked the spiritual unity and willingness to accept casualties necessary for victory in protracted conflict. This assumption encouraged aggressive operations during 1941 and 1942, designed to establish a defensive perimeter that would make reconquest so costly that Americans would negotiate peace rather than pay the required price in blood and resources. The fundamental error in this strategic conception became apparent far earlier than Japan's final collapse. American industrial mobilization proved far more rapid and comprehensive than Japanese planners had anticipated. American willingness to accept casualties while prosecuting offensive operations contradicted assumptions about Western individualism, supposedly precluding sacrifice for collective goals. American technological and operational innovation accelerated rather than stagnated, producing weapon systems and tactical doctrines that consistently surprised Japanese forces, expecting crude, predictable approaches. The intelligence failure regarding a single aircraft's payload capacity represented merely one small symptom of these larger analytical failures that had doomed Japanese strategy from the beginning. The story of Japanese intelligence underestimating the Avengers' capabilities illuminates broader questions about how military organizations assess enemy capabilities under wartime conditions and how institutional culture shapes intelligence analysis. Effective intelligence work requires not merely technical competence in analysts, but organizational structures and cultural norms that encourage rigorous self-criticism, willingness to acknowledge error, and systematic updating of assessments when new evidence emerges. Japanese military institutions during World War II possessed analysts with substantial technical knowledge and professional dedication, yet consistently produced flawed intelligence, assessments that contributed to disastrous strategic decisions. The organizational culture problem manifested in several specific ways that the Avenger case illustrates clearly. Junior analysts who identified evidence contradicting established assessments faced institutional pressure to conform rather than advocate for reassessment. The cultural emphasis on harmony and respect for hierarchy discouraged the kind of direct challenge to senior officers' assumptions that accurate intelligence sometimes requires. When fragmentary combat reports suggested American aircraft might possess greater capabilities than official estimates indicated, the path of least resistance involved explaining away discrepancies or attributing them to observer error rather than initiating formal reassessment processes. Senior commanders reinforced this dynamic by displaying resistance to intelligence conclusions that contradicted strategic narratives or required acknowledging that previous planning had rested on flawed assumptions. Military leaders naturally prefer intelligence assessments that confirm their operational plans remain viable rather than assessments demanding fundamental strategic revision. Japanese commanders during 1944 and 1945 faced increasingly desperate strategic circumstances that created powerful psychological incentives to dismiss or minimize intelligence, suggesting their situation was even worse than they already recognized. Accepting that American aircraft carried heavier ordnance than previously estimated meant acknowledging that defensive planning had been inadequate, potentially requiring politically difficult decisions to reallocate scarce resources. The communication problems between field units and central intelligence organizations further degraded assessment accuracy. Combat units that directly encountered American forces possessed the most current observational data, but this information often failed to reach intelligence analysts in usable form. Reports that did reach Tokyo frequently arrived weeks or months after the relevant observations, by which time operational situations had evolved substantially. The intelligence staffs responsible for synthesizing information from multiple sources and maintaining comprehensive capability assessments operated with chronic information delays that prevented timely updating of estimates. These institutional problems were not unique to Japanese military organizations. All military intelligence services struggle with similar challenges, balancing the need for stable planning assumptions against the need to update assessments when new evidence emerges, managing tensions between field observers and central analysts, and avoiding the institutional tendency to confirm rather than challenge established beliefs. The Japanese case is notable primarily for how completely these institutional pathologies contributed to catastrophic strategic failure, not for the pathologies themselves being particularly unusual. The American intelligence community faced its own challenges and made significant errors during the Pacific War, particularly in assessing Japanese capabilities during the conflict's early phases. American pre-war intelligence had underestimated Japanese aviation capabilities, leading to painful surprises when Japanese aircraft and pilots proved far more capable than expected. American assessments of Japanese industrial capacity sometimes erred in the opposite direction from Japanese assessments of American capacity, overestimating Japan's ability to sustain production and replace losses. However, American intelligence organizations demonstrated greater organizational flexibility in updating assessments when combat experience revealed errors, partly because American strategic success created less psychological pressure to deny uncomfortable realities. The legacy of intelligence failures like the Avenger payload underestimation extends beyond World War II to influence how modern military organizations approach intelligence, analysis, and capability assessment. Contemporary intelligence services study historical cases of analytical failure to identify recurring patterns and develop organizational practices designed to mitigate similar errors. The recognition that institutional culture powerfully shapes analytical outcomes has led to training programs emphasizing critical thinking, structured analytic techniques designed to counter cognitive biases, and organizational reforms intended to protect analysts who challenge prevailing assumptions from institutional retaliation. The question of whether more accurate Japanese intelligence regarding American aircraft capabilities would have materially altered the Pacific War's outcome requires careful consideration. Japanese forces faced overwhelming disadvantages across virtually every dimension of military power. By 1944, industrial capacity, resource availability, trained personnel, technological sophistication, and strategic position. No plausible improvement in intelligence assessment could have overcome these fundamental imbalances. Even perfect knowledge of American capabilities would not have enabled Japanese forces to counter them effectively given the constraints they faced. Yet, intelligence failures like the Avenger payload miscalculation mattered despite not being strategically decisive, because they exemplified systematic analytical problems that influenced Japanese decision-making throughout the conflict. The pattern of underestimating American capabilities while overestimating Japanese advantages contributed to strategic choices that accelerated Japan's defeat. The decision to initiate war against the United States in December of 1941 rested partly on assumptions about American industrial capacity, technological sophistication, and national will that proved catastrophically wrong. Had Japanese leadership possessed more accurate understanding of what they would face, the decision to risk total war might have been reconsidered. At the tactical level, intelligence failures directly cost lives and consumed resources that Japan could not afford to waste. Defensive planning based on underestimates of American striking power allocated insufficient resources to counter actual threats, resulting in defeats that might have been less severe had defenses been properly scaled to the threat. Japanese pilots who engaged American aircraft while laboring under misconceptions about enemy capabilities faced additional disadvantages beyond those imposed by material factors. Understanding that the Avenger formations bearing down on your position carried substantially heavier ordnance than you had been led to expect would not enable you to shoot them down more effectively, but the repeated discovery that enemy capabilities exceeded intelligence estimates eroded confidence in leadership and institutional competence at moments when morale already suffered from obvious strategic deterioration. Lieutenant Commander Harwood returned safely to the USS Anzio after his mission over the East China Sea, and his aircraft and crew intact, despite exposure to whatever limited anti-aircraft fire Japanese defenders could still muster. The 2,000-pound torpedo his Avenger had carried remained unexpended targets had not materialized during this particular sortie. Thousands of similar missions occurred during the war's final months, American carrier aircraft ranging across Japanese-controlled waters and airspace, with mounting confidence that effective opposition had largely ceased. Some of these missions encountered fierce resistance from determined defenders who fought skillfully and bravely despite hopeless odds. Others met no opposition whatsoever, as Japanese forces husbanded remaining strength for expected invasion or simply lacked capacity to contest American operations. The institutional failure to accurately assess something as specific and measurable as an aircraft's payload. Capacity reflects the immense difficulty of conducting effective intelligence work under wartime conditions, particularly for organizations facing catastrophic strategic defeat. Japanese intelligence analysts were not incompetent or negligent. They worked within institutional structures and cultural contexts that systematically biased analysis toward conclusions that minimized enemy capabilities and maintained comfortable assumptions about relative national strengths. The fragmentary, ambiguous evidence available to them could support multiple interpretations, and institutional pressures encouraged interpretations that aligned with established beliefs rather than challenging them. The story completes its circle, returning to that morning over the East China Sea where an American torpedo bomber carried ordnance that enemy intelligence had systematically underestimated. The miscalculation was small, a difference of several hundred pounds in a conflict where millions of tons of ordnance were expended. Yet it embodied something larger and more consequential: the systematic failure of Japanese institutions to accurately understand the enemy they faced, a failure that contributed to strategic decisions and tactical planning that led inexorably toward total defeat. Understanding what your enemy can actually do, not what you wish or assume they can do, represents perhaps the most fundamental requirement of effective military planning. Japan's inability to achieve this understanding, exemplified clearly in something as specific as an Avenger's payload capacity, helped ensure that the war they had initiated would end in their complete destruction. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.